Imagine waking up to news that China has quietly pulled over $2 trillion out of the US financial system. No warnings, no announcements, just a silent economic weapon being deployed that could collapse the American banking system within months. Well, you don't have to imagine it because it's happening right now, and by the time you finish watching this video, you will understand exactly why this is the most dangerous financial move of the century and what it means for every dollar in your bank account. Before we dive into this financial earthquake, you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications immediately. What I'm about to reveal is information that could protect you from the biggest wealth transfer in modern history. Don't skip this. Your financial future depends on it. Let's start with the numbers that Wall Street doesn't want you to see. China holds approximately $2 trillion in US Treasury bonds and has massive deposits in American banks. For decades, this money has been the backbone of US government financing and bank liquidity. But starting in late 2024 and accelerating into 2026, China has been systematically withdrawing this capital. They're selling Treasury bonds at record rates, they're pulling deposits from US banks, they're liquidating dollar-denominated assets across the board. This isn't a minor adjustment, this is financial warfare. Why does this matter to you? Because when China pulls $2 trillion out of the US financial system, someone has to fill that gap. And guess who that someone is? The Federal Reserve, which means more money printing. Your taxes, which means you're paying for it directly, or nobody, which means bank failures and economic collapse. None of these options are good for your savings, your job, or your financial security. Let me explain how the US financial system became addicted to Chinese money. For the past 30 years, China has been buying US Treasury bonds like crazy. Every time the US government needed to borrow money to fund its deficit spending, China was there to buy the debt. This relationship was beneficial for both sides. China got a safe place to park its trade surplus dollars. America got cheap financing for its spending addiction. But that relationship is now dead, and the consequences are catastrophic. Here's how it worked. China exports massive amounts of goods to America. Americans buy Chinese products, sending dollars to China. China then takes those dollars and buys US Treasury bonds and deposits money in US banks. This recycling of dollars kept interest rates low, allowed the government to spend freely, and kept the banking system flush with cash. It was a perfect arrangement until geopolitical tensions destroyed the trust. The turning point came with increasing hostility between Washington and Beijing. Technology restrictions, tariffs, Taiwan tensions, South China Sea disputes. Every escalation made China realize that keeping trillions of dollars in a potentially hostile country was a massive strategic vulnerability. What if the US freezes Chinese assets like it did with Russian assets? What if sanctions cut China off from the dollar system? These aren't theoretical concerns. They're real threats that Chinese leadership is taking deadly seriously. So China started the Great Exit, quietly at first, then accelerating rapidly. In 2022, China held over $1 trillion in US Treasury bonds. By early 2026, that number has dropped below $800 billion, and it's falling fast. They're selling tens of billions every single month. But Treasury bonds are just the visible part. The real story is what's happening in the banking system. Chinese state-owned enterprises, wealthy Chinese individuals, and Chinese corporations have been pulling deposits out of US banks at an unprecedented rate. Money that was parked in Bank of America, JPMorgan Chase, Citigroup, and other major institutions is being withdrawn and moved to Chinese banks, European banks, anywhere but America. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in deposit flight that isn't being reported in mainstream news. Here's why this is absolutely terrifying. Banks operate on something called fractional reserve banking. They only keep a small percentage of deposits as actual cash. The rest is loaned out or invested. When massive depositors like Chinese entities withdraw their money, banks face a liquidity crisis. They don't have the cash on hand to cover the withdrawals. This is exactly what causes bank runs and bank failures. Remember Silicon Valley Bank that collapsed in 2023? That was triggered by depositors pulling their money out faster than the bank could liquidate assets. Now imagine that scenario playing out across the entire banking system because Chinese depositors are pulling out $2 trillion. The potential for systemic collapse is enormous, but it gets worse. As China sells US Treasury bonds, interest rates rise. Why? Because there's less demand for the bonds, so the government has to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. Higher interest rates mean higher borrowing costs for everyone. Your mortgage becomes more expensive, credit cards cost more, business loans are harder to get. The entire economy slows down, and the government's interest payments on the national debt skyrocket, making the debt crisis even worse. The Federal Reserve is desperately trying to prevent this disaster. They're buying the Treasury bonds that China is selling, essentially printing money to absorb the selling pressure. But this creates massive inflation. Every dollar the Fed prints to buy bonds is a dollar that dilutes the value of every dollar you own. Your savings lose purchasing power. Your paycheck buys less. You get poorer while the government maintains the illusion that everything is fine. Let's talk about the geopolitical chess game being played here. China isn't just pulling money out randomly. This is a calculated strategic move designed to weaken American financial power while strengthening China's own position. They're using the withdrawn dollars to buy gold, stockpile commodities, invest in belt and road infrastructure projects, and build alternative financial systems that don't depend on the dollar. The BRICS nations are creating their own payment systems, their own reserve currency alternatives, their own financial infrastructure. China is leading this charge, and every dollar they pull out of the US system is a dollar that goes into building the anti-dollar financial architecture. This is the most significant shift in global finance since the Bretton Woods Agreement established dollar dominance after World War II. Think about what this means strategically. For 70 years, the United States has had enormous power because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Countries need dollars to trade. They hold dollars as reserves. This demand for dollars allows America to print money, run deficits, and maintain its military empire without immediate consequences. But if China and other countries successfully create alternatives to the dollar system, that power evaporates overnight. The withdrawal of Chinese capital is accelerating this process. Every treasury bond China sells is one less dollar the world needs. Every deposit pulled from US banks is less dollar demand. Every yuan-denominated trade deal is a transaction that doesn't require dollars. Death by 1,000 cuts. The dollar's dominance is being systematically dismantled, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. Here's what the mainstream media isn't telling you. Major US banks are already facing stress from Chinese capital flight. They're not failing yet because the Fed is providing emergency liquidity behind the scenes. But this can't continue indefinitely. The Fed can't print unlimited money without destroying the currency. There will come a breaking point where they have to choose between saving the banks and saving the dollar, and history shows they always choose to save the banks, which means the dollar gets sacrificed. Let me give you some concrete examples of what's happening right now. Chinese companies that had billions in deposits at US banks have quietly moved that money to Asian and European institutions. Wealthy Chinese families who kept money in America for safety are now viewing it as a liability and moving funds to Singapore, Switzerland, and Dubai. Even ordinary Chinese citizens who could access US banking are pulling out whatever they can. This capital flight is compounding America's problems. The US already runs a massive trade deficit, meaning we import more than we export. For years, China recycled those trade deficit dollars back to us by buying bonds and keeping deposits here. But now they're keeping those dollars overseas or converting them to other currencies and assets. This means the US has to find new sources of financing, and there aren't many countries willing or able to replace China. Japan is already maxed out on US Treasury holdings. European countries have their own debt problems. Middle Eastern oil states are diversifying away from the dollar. Who's left to buy American debt? The only buyer of last resort is the Federal Reserve, which means money printing, which means inflation, which means your wealth gets destroyed. The timeline for this crisis is accelerating. In 2024, the pace of Chinese Treasury sales was gradual. In 2025, it picked up significantly. Now in 2026, it's reaching critical levels. At the current rate, China could reduce its US Treasury holdings to nearly zero within 2 to 3 years. The banking deposit withdrawal could be even faster if geopolitical tensions escalate further. What triggers could accelerate this process? A conflict over Taiwan would cause immediate and total capital flight. Sanctions on China would force them to dump all dollar assets immediately. Even continued trade tensions and technology restrictions are enough to keep the exit going. And here's the scary part. The US government's response to Chinese capital flight is making things worse, not better. Politicians are talking about sanctions, asset freezes, and restrictions on Chinese investments. Every threat makes China more determined to get their money out before it's too late. It's a vicious cycle where American hostility drives Chinese exit, which weakens American finances, which causes more American hostility. This spiral ends in disaster. Now, let's talk about what this means for your personal finances, because that's what really matters. When China pulls $2 trillion out of the US financial system, the ripple effects hit everyone. Banks become less stable, meaning your deposits are at higher risk. Interest rates rise, meaning your debt becomes more expensive. The dollar weakens, meaning your purchasing power declines. Asset prices become volatile, meaning your investments are in danger. If you have significant money in US banks, you need to understand that bank deposits are only insured up to $250,000 by the FDIC. Anything above that is at risk if the bank fails. And with the stress that Chinese capital flight is putting on the banking system, bank failures are a real possibility. We've already seen multiple regional bank failures in recent years. Larger failures could be coming. Your investment portfolio is also at risk. If China continues dumping US assets, stock markets will become extremely volatile. Bond markets are already showing stress, Real estate markets could face pressure as Chinese buyers who are propping up luxury property markets disappear. Every asset class tied to the U.S. financial system is vulnerable to the Chinese exit. So what can you do to protect yourself? First, diversify out of pure dollar exposure. This doesn't mean abandoning dollars completely, but it means not having all your wealth in dollar-denominated assets. Consider holding some precious metals like gold and silver that aren't tied to any country's currency. Look at real assets like property, commodities, and productive businesses that have intrinsic value beyond paper currency. Second, don't keep more than $250,000 in any single bank account. Spread your deposits across multiple institutions to stay under the FDIC insurance limit. Better yet, keep only what you need for immediate expenses in banks, and move the rest into tangible assets. Third, pay attention to the geopolitical situation between the US and China. Any major escalation, especially regarding Taiwan, could trigger massive capital flight overnight. If tensions spike, be prepared to move money quickly to safer positions. Fourth, consider international diversification. Having some assets outside the US dollar system provides protection if the dollar financial system faces serious stress. This could mean foreign currency accounts, international real estate, or assets in politically stable countries with strong property rights. The Chinese capital exit is also creating opportunities for those who understand what's happening. As China sells US Treasuries, yields rise, which means you can get higher returns on bonds. As Chinese money flows into gold, gold prices are rising, benefiting those who positioned early. As dollars flow out of the US, certain international markets are becoming more attractive. Crisis creates opportunity for the informed and prepared. But here's the critical point. This isn't just an investment story. This is a fundamental restructuring of the global financial system. The post-World War II order built on dollar dominance is crumbling. China's $2 trillion exit is both a symptom and a cause of this transformation. The world is moving toward a multipolar financial system where the dollar is no longer the unchallenged king. For Americans, this means a lower standard of living. Dollar dominance has allowed the U.S. to live beyond its means for decades. We import cheap goods, pay with printed dollars, and those dollars get recycled back to finance our debt. When that cycle breaks, Americans will face higher prices for imports, higher interest rates on debt, and lower real wages. The party is ending, and the hangover will be brutal. The banking sector faces an existential crisis. If $2 trillion exits the system, and the Fed can't print enough money to replace it without causing runaway inflation, banks will fail. We could see a 2008-style financial crisis, but potentially much worse because the underlying problems are bigger and the tools to fix them are more limited. The geopolitics are incredibly dangerous. Financial desperation often leads to political extremism and military conflict. As the U.S. financial position weakens, the temptation to use military power to maintain dominance increases. China knows this, which is why they're moving so carefully and quietly. But accidents happen. Miscalculations occur. The risk of conflict is rising alongside the financial stress. Here's what keeps me up at night. The American public is completely unprepared for what's coming. Most people have no idea that China is pulling out of the U.S. financial system. They don't understand how dependent America has been on Chinese capital. They trust that their bank deposits are safe, that the dollar is stable, that the system will hold together. But the mathematics and the geopolitics tell a very different story. When the crisis hits, and it will hit, millions of Americans will lose their savings, their jobs, their homes, not because they did anything wrong, but because they didn't see it coming. They trusted the system. They believed the government would protect them. They thought America was too big to fail. But empires always fall, and financial dominance never lasts forever. The Chinese know this. They've studied the history of reserve currencies. The Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, all were dominant global currencies that eventually collapsed. The dollar is no different. It's just a matter of timing and catalyst. And China's $2 trillion exit might be the catalyst that accelerates the process. If this video opened your eyes to the silent financial war being waged against the US dollar, I need you to take action right now. Hit that like button to help spread this critical information. Share this video with your friends, family, and anyone who needs to understand what's really happening to the American financial system. Drop a comment below and let me know if you're seeing signs of this crisis in your own life. Are interest rates rising on your loans? Is your bank acting strange? Are you preparing for financial instability? Most importantly, subscribe to the Geopolitics Code and smash that notification bell. I'm dedicated to bringing you the economic and geopolitical analysis that mainstream media refuses to cover. The Chinese capital exit is just beginning, and the next few years will determine whether America maintains its financial dominance or loses it forever. You need to stay informed to protect yourself. China's $2 trillion exit isn't a conspiracy theory. It's documented fact that you can verify in Treasury reports and banking data. The question isn't if this will impact you. The question is whether you'll be prepared when it does. Protect yourself now while you still have time. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we will discuss specific strategies for surviving the collapse of dollar dominance.